Our event tonight inaugurates the Institute's speaker series for fall 2018 on the theme of patriotism, nationalism, and the idea of America. As I've said in earlier notices of the Institute's fall program, Donald Trump's presidential campaign and presidency have urged in various moments a revival of American patriotism and nationalism. His clarion call has been America first. And this attitude is indicated in a range of policies and proposals related to immigration, trade, international security, and other matters. Donald Trump's election and presidency concur with other revivals of nationalistic spirit worldwide and prompt thoughtful Americans to consider carefully the idea of America, the role of the United States in the international community, and the obligations of American citizens to other citizens and to humanity at large. Few are as well positioned as our guest speaker to keynote the Institute's fall program with this theme. Widely regarded as one of the most engaging, insightful, and nuanced political commentators of our time, David Brooks is a columnist for the New York Times, a regular political analyst on the PBS NewsHour and NPR's All Things Considered, and the author of a number of rich and important books, the most recent being The Road to Character, published in 2015. He worked at the Wall Street Journal for 9 years and has written for The New Yorker, Forbes, The Washington Post, and many other periodicals. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he teaches at Yale University. Some of his many other accomplishments are listed in the program that we have made available for the event tonight. In his writing and commentary, David Brooks has often reflected on the meaning of America. In moments, he has advocated what I would call a chastened nationalism, one that celebrates the virtues of America, but also worries about new forms of American tribalism, both domestic and international. He commends an American patriotism that prizes national unity, but appreciates diversity within the nation and in the larger world. He articulates a vision of the American dream that, and I quote his own words, says no to tribe and yes to the open future, no to the fear-driven homogeneity of the old continent, and yes to the diverse hopefulness of the new one. Brooks's proposals here are controversial, but they are civilly expressed, and they invite civil conversation and debate. In that spirit of civility, will you please join me in welcoming our speaker tonight, David Brooks.
They asked me to speak about patriotism, nationalism, but I thought they meant Norwegian patriotism, but I'll switch over and do that one. It's great to be back here in Minnesota. I'm a frequent visitor here, not to campus. This is my first time to campus, but I'm in the Twin Cities all the time. I spend a lot of time around Minnesota politicians for some reason. When I got my current job at the New York Times, I was given a good piece of advice, which is to interview 3 politicians every day, which I spent a lot of time doing. I can tell you they're all emotional freaks of one sort or another. They have what I call emotional logorrhea dementia, which is talking so much they drive themselves insane. But I, for some reason, fell in with the Minnesota Mafia. Knew Orville and Connie Freeman back in the day, Don Frazier, if you remember that. I got to know Dave Dernberger, who's still up at St. Thomas early in my life. He told me, become a moderate Republican, that's the future. So that worked. And I'm a big admirer and fan of Walter Mondale, of course, and a childhood hero of mine. On my wall in my bedroom was a poster of Hubert Humphrey's presidential campaign. And the slogan on top was, some do change, some only talk change. And so early on, I realized I only wanted to talk change. I didn't want to do change. And now one of my favorite senators is Amy Klobuchar. And I've told this story so many times, I'm really not sure if it's true, but I was flying back from the Twin Cities to D.C., and I was bumped up to first class, and she was also bumped up to first class. And the story is to illustrate that some senators, you're a little afraid of them, but with Klobuchar, she's like a normal human being. And so because she's a senator, we were sitting like in 2A and B, and she went back to work the room, back in the back of the plane to shake hands, meet people. And then she came up back into the first class cabin, and the flight attendant said, I'm sorry, ma'am, you're not allowed to come back up here. And she looked at me pleadingly, and I said, I've never seen this woman before in my life. I don't know. And so she represents, like, usually senators, they have somewhat ego. Someone said they don't have heads, they have containers for heads, but she is just a normal, good human being. So I will talk about patriotism and American nationalism and really the state of society. But I want to do it from a somewhat deeper level than I normally do. I'm at a college, and people know me as a somewhat bookish, somewhat overly cognitive person. When I was 7, I read a book called Paddington the Bear, and I realized at that moment I wanted to become a writer. And I remember in high school I wanted to date some woman named Bernice, and she didn't want to date me, she wanted to date some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. And so that was the cerebral start to my life. The admissions officers at Columbia, Wesleyan, and Brown decided I should go to the University of Chicago. And as you know about Chicago, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. It's my favorite thing. And so it is a bookish school, and I was a bookish person there. I double majored in history and celibacy while I was there. And I actually I became a boxing manager there. I had a friend he was the kosher killer, but we didn't actually just learn boxing, we just read books about boxing. And then he entered the Chicago Golden Gloves, and because of a bunch of injuries, he got a bye all the way up to the semifinals. So he comes out swinging, and his arms are over his head because he's never boxed in his life. The other boxer shoots back into the corner and realizes 92 seconds in, well, this guy has his head down. One uppercut ends this fight, which is what happened. But that was our Chicago way of conquering the world. And it was bookish. And then I got a job, even on TV. It was a bookish show that I'm on. I'm on a show called The News Hour with a guy named Mark Shields. We have a segment called Shields and Brooks. We should have called it Brooke Shields. It would have been better. And it is, I think, a more civil and cerebral kind of show compared to the other TV shows. We have a certain demographic. If a 93-year-old lady comes up to me in the airport, I know what she's going to say. I don't watch your show, but my mother loves it. We're very big in the hospice community, and so even that's bookish. And then I got a job writing a column for the New York Times. I'm the conservative columnist of the New York Times, which is a job I liken to being chief rabbi in Mecca. Not a lot of company there. And so that's all just writing and reading books. And as you get older, your tastes get a little more feminine, I think a little more sensitive. And so I'm the only American man who finished that book, Eat, Pray, Love. If you've ever read that book. By page 123, I was actually lactating, which was amazing. And then I wrote a book about emotion called The Social Animal. And my friends joke that me writing a book about emotion was like Gandhi writing a book about gluttony. It's not the natural thing because I'm not emotionally emotional. And then most recently I wrote a book about character, or a book called The Road to Character. And I learned writing that book that writing a book on character doesn't give you good character. And reading a book on character doesn't give you good character. But buying a book on character does give you good character. So I recommend that. So all this is to say, I'm here at a college campus. It's a bookish place. I'm a bookish person. And yet I do think that our cognitive rational brain is the third most important part of our consciousness. And that the first is the desiring heart. I read a story about a guy not long ago who bought a house, and there was a bamboo stand growing by the driveway in the front yard. And he didn't like bamboo, and so he chopped it down. He took an axe to the root system. He dumped a bunch of plant poison. He covered the hole over with 3 foot of gravel and 6 inches of cement. And 2 years later, little shoot of bamboo coming up through the cement. And I think we have that in ourselves, which is our desire. St. Augustine had it right. We're not primarily cognitive creatures. We're primarily desiring creatures. You become what you love. There were orphanages in Nevada where they took kids who were 2.5 years old, or 0 to 2.5, and they wanted to give them nutrition, and they wanted to give them health care, but they did not want to touch them because they didn't want to get germs. This is back in the 40s. And the kids had a 38% mortality rate because it's physical touch and affection that literally wires the fibers of the brain together. The Grant study, this great longitudinal study done at Harvard, found that men who had no love in their homes as children were 3 times more likely to suffer from mental illness, 2.5 times more likely to suffer from dementia, and they made 50% less money over the course of their careers. So it is the nature of how much love is poured into us that determines how we do in life, and what our heart primarily wants is fusion with another person, is intimate connection, the kind of connection that Louis de Bernier described in his book, Captain Corelli's Mandolin. In that book, there's an old guy talking to his daughter about his late wife. And he says to her, "Love itself is what is left over when being in love is burned away. And this is both an art and a fortunate accident. Your mother and I had it. We had roots that grew towards each other underground. And when all the pretty blossoms had fallen from our branches, we found out that we were one tree and not two." I think that's what we want, to fuse with one another. The second most important quality is the yearning soul. Now, I don't ask you to believe in God or not believe in God. That's really not my department. But I do ask you to believe that there's a piece of you that has no shape, size, or color or weight, but is of infinite value and dignity. That rich and successful people don't have more of this than poor or less successful older people, not more than younger people. That slavery is wrong because it's an obliteration of another human being's soul. That rape is not just an attack on a bunch of physical molecules, but it's an obliteration of another person's soul. And so obscenity is anything that covers over another's soul. And what the soul mostly does is it yearns for righteousness. It yearns for goodness. I've covered crimes, I've covered wars, I've met people who've committed genocide and killed hundreds of thousands of people. I've never met anybody who didn't secretly want to be good. Prisoners want to be good. If we feel that our life is not good and meaningful, our life has a tendency to fall apart. And so what Plato said, what we do when we're educated, is we naturally climb a ladder of loves. Plato said, if you want to educate the young, show them a beautiful face. And they'll see the beautiful face is a beautiful thing, but there's a higher beauty, which is a beautiful personality. And when they see the higher beauty of a personality, they'll see there's a higher beauty than that, which is a beautiful society, which is justice. And when they see the beauty of that, they'll realize there's even higher beauty, which is truth and the search for truth. And when they see that, they'll see there's the highest beauty from which nothing can be added and nothing can be taken, which is the beauty of the whole universe. And we all have that yearning to have higher loves. And the highest thing the soul longs for, I think, is to be connected and pursuing some ideal, often in connection with one other people. And so there's a passage from Rabbi Wolf Kellman, who marched in Selma with Martin Luther King, and he describes what it was like to march across the bridge with King. He said, "We felt connected in song to the transcendental, the ineffable. We felt triumph and celebration. We felt that things change for the good and nothing is congealed forever. That was the warmest transcendental spiritual experience. Meaning and purpose and mission were beyond exact words. Meaning was the feeling, the song, the moment of overwhelming spiritual fulfillment. And so to me, everything I say follows from this seeing human beings not just as cognitive heads, but as hearts and as souls. And one of the things hearts and souls do, and minds, and one of the things we do collectively is we create cultures, we create norms. And a culture is a collective enterprise to solve the problems of the day. And I'd like to walk us through three cultures up to where we are, three cultural moments. And the first is the culture between 1932 and 1968. That was a generation that had to face some big problems, the Depression, the World Wars, and they built a moral culture organized around big institutions and collectivity. They built a culture around a phrase that you might say, we're all in this together. It was a very communal culture. If you grew up on the Chicago South Side, you probably went to a big employer, the Army, labor unions, IBM. If you grew up in a certain neighborhood, you probably went to the Nabisco plant where your father and your grandfather worked. You probably joined the same big union. If you lived in a neighborhood there, and here too, in the Twin Cities, you were part of a tight community. If somebody asked you, where are you from, you didn't say, I'm from Chicago. You said, I'm from 59th and Pulaski, because the tight neighborhood defined your people. And there were babysitting cooperatives, there were coffee clutches, there were barbecues. It took an enormous amount of effort to be a loner in that community. There was no TV and no air conditioning, so people were running into each other's houses, the kids, and they had a really tight community. If you went into politics like much else, you didn't do it as an individual, you did it as part of an organization. In Chicago, of course, it was Boss Daley's machine. You worked for the machine. There was a guy named John Ferry who joined the machine. Boss Daley sent him to Springfield, to the Illinois State Legislature, where he served for 20 years. And then at the end, Boss Daley said, I'll reward him. I'll send him to the U.S. Congress in Washington just so I can say he was a congressman. And the reporters asked Ferry, how are you going to vote when you get to Washington? And Ferry replied, I will go to Washington to help represent Mayor Daley. For 21 years, I represented the mayor in the legislature, and he was always right. And so that's deference to authority. And this culture had a lot of good things. Sense of modesty, sense of community, sense of humility, and a very clear awareness of what the American story was, a coherent view of the nation. In the 1950s, there was a series of historians called the consensus historians, and they saw America as this great covenantal project. European Puritans came to our shores in the 17th century, and they saw massive abundance in front of them. So they saw flocks of geese so big it took them 45 minutes to take off. They would actually shoot cannons into the flocks of geese just to see if they could alter their direction. And two thoughts came to them. One, that God's plans for humanity could be completed on this continent, and two, they could get really rich in the process. And so this was a country of moral materialism. And this was a country, an eschatological country, a country where the future was always more important than the present. Because it was a country being created, it was an Exodus story. It was people who'd left the old world, the tyranny, had crossed the wilderness and were coming to build the promised land. The settlers would go west, and they'd pass by perfectly good farmland in Ohio because they were convinced something even better was further down the road. There's a novel I'm sure you all know called Giants of the Earth, set not too far from here. And if you remember this novel, there's a scene where the farmer's taken around a visitor to his farm, and he says, this is our farmland, this is where the pastures are going to be, this is everything. And the visitor says, I don't see any barns or anything. And the host says, well, we haven't built it yet. But he's seeing the present from the vantage point of the future. And that was a classically American thing. And the Puritans came up with the idea that we are an Exodus country. The founders, Ben Franklin, wanted to put Moses on the Great Seal of the United States because we are an Exodus country. My immigrant ancestors came here seeing this as an Exodus country. Martin Luther King spoke of the Exodus more than he spoke of the New Testament. And that was the story of America, a covenantal nation, the last best hope of earth. And there was a great national consensus about that. There were weaknesses to that culture too. Some of the weaknesses were racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, emotional coldness, really boring food. And so people decided to chop up that culture. People felt oppressed. It was too conformist, too organization man. They couldn't express themselves. In 1962, a bunch of young people got together in Michigan and created the Port Huron Statement, which says, I want to be free to be myself. I'm sick of this tight community. We have too much community in this country. And so there was a cultural shift. The shift is symbolized to me in a great event of my childhood, which was Super Bowl III. In 1969 or 70, two quarterbacks faced each other in the Super Bowl where the Baltimore Colts played the New York Jets. And they both grew up within about 5 or 10 miles of each other in western Pennsylvania, but 10 years apart. One of them was a guy named Johnny Unitas, typical 1950s guy, crew cut, high-top shoes, played football like a plumber. A really good player, but just workmanlike and boring. On my side of the field, the New York Jets, was a guy named Joe Namath. He had long hair, $5,000 fur coats, posed for pantyhose ads. He was a big swinger. He wrote a memoir called I Can't Wait Until Tomorrow Because I Get Better Looking Every Day. And Johnny Unitas would not have written that memoir. And so there was a shift in culture. Suddenly it was cool to be young, not old, expressive, not reticent, casual, not formal, a rebel, not a conformist, and individual and not institutional. The idea was liberation. Liberation from the bonds of religion, liberation from the bonds of class, liberated to sexually express yourself as you wanted, liberated by technology. And it was about individual liberation, and it brought us a lot of great things. When cultures shift, there's usually a reason. Cultures shift by a habit one social theorist called the ratchet, hatchet, pivot, ratchet process. The culture has a problem, so they create a new culture, and you ratchet upwards, you solve it. After a while, it runs out of steam, it becomes more obsolete, and so people hatchet it up. And so, but human ingenuity is important, so people pivot over. And then they solve the problem again, and they ratchet up again. And so we move upwards this way. And so we got the civil rights movement out of this shift in culture. We got feminism out of this shift in culture. We got rock and roll out of this shift in culture. I don't think we could have had the creative individualism of Silicon Valley, that rebel culture, if we hadn't shifted to a more individualistic culture. So it worked for a while. It also, over time, produced some bad things. First, a rise in narcissism. The essence that the answer to all your problems are inside yourself. Be true to yourself. You. Do your own thing. So there's a thing called the narcissism test where they ask people, I'm going to read you a bunch of statements. Does it apply to you? And they're statements like, I find it easy to manipulate people because I'm so extraordinary. Or somebody should write a book about me. I like to look at my body. The media's narcissism score has risen 30% in the last 20 years. There's a study done, and with that has gone a desire for fame. There's a study done where they asked people, would you like to be president of Harvard or a celebrity's personal assistant, Justin Bieber's personal assistant? And by 3-1, people would rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant than president of Harvard. Though to be fair, I asked the president of Harvard, and she would rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant. And so we've had a run of about 60 years of individualism. And it's had some, when you take any true idea and pursue it to its extreme, it becomes false. And we've taken individualism and pushed it pretty far. And the first bad result is isolation. In 1980, 20% of Americans reported feeling lonely. Now twice as many do. 35% of people over 45 are chronically lonely. In 1970, married couples entertained their friends on average of 15 times a year. Now it's only 8 times a year. Only 8% of Americans report having significant conversations with their neighbors. The fastest growing political party is unaffiliated. The fastest growing religious movement is unaffiliated. 9 million men have dropped out of the labor force. Suicide rates have been rising since 1999. One of your former guests, Jonathan Haidt, told me the other day that over the last 15 or 20 years, teenage male suicide rates have gone up 25%, and teenage female suicide rates have gone up 70%. And suicide is a proxy for loneliness. 45,000 people die of suicide every year, 55,000 people die of opiate addiction every year, and opiate addiction is just slow-motion suicide. The second is an institutional crisis, a crisis of trust. If you asked people back in that we're all in this together era, do you trust the institutions of your society? 80% said yes. Now it's down to about 20%. Massive decline in trust in our institutions. If you asked people in that era, do you trust the people around you are trustworthy? About 60% said, yeah, my neighbors are trustworthy. Now if you ask that question, 32% say yes, including 19% of millennials. Trust in institutions went away all at once in Vietnam and Watergate. Trust in each other has been going down steadily over the last few decades, so the younger you get, the more distrustful you are. And as Robert Putnam of Harvard said, it's not perception, it's reality. People are less trusting because people are less trustworthy. The third crisis is the crisis of amputation. We divide ourselves, in our meritocracy, we treat ourselves as brains and talents and human resources to be harvested, not as souls to be realized. Our schools often treat our students as brains on a stick and ignore the rest. And when you amputate that part of reality, you leave a lot of people who are good at figuring out what to do, but not good at finding what to do or why they're doing it. And that leads to the fourth crisis, which is a crisis of meaning, a crisis of purpose and telos. It's amazing to me that mental health problems are rising, not falling, that depression rates are rising, not falling. I see it in my students. They graduate from school, they hit a crisis at 25, which is bound to happen, and they crater. And why does that happen? Nietzsche says, he who has a why to live for can endure anyhow. He who has a why to live for can endure anyhow. If you don't know why you're living, then when the hard times come, you crater. And so these 3 or 4 crises have produced a further crisis. Psychologists say the hardest thing to cure is the patient's attempt to self-cure. And when you leave people naked and alone, which the 60 years of individualism has done, it's left us naked and alone, people do what their evolutionary roots tell them to do. They revert to tribe. And that's essentially what's happened over the last 15 years to our politics. We have what we call negative polarization. Do you like your own party? Not particularly. Do you hate the other party? Totally. And so what we have is a tribal mentality. Now, tribalism is community for narcissists. Tribalism is not built on mutual affection, it's built on mutual distrust. And so it's a certain sort of mentality. It's us versus them, friend-enemy distinction, life is conflict, politics is war, society is tribal, build walls, erect barriers, believe conspiracies, make accusations. I spent some time not long ago with Steve Bannon, and I found it fascinating. It was like being with Trotsky in 1905. And he has like a 100-year plan. He doesn't believe in diversity. He thinks Donald Trump is only a piece of his plan. He's going to take over this institution, that institution. He's either crazy or genius. I don't know. I'm hoping the first one, but I don't know. But he does understand that this kind of tribalism is on the march. He's got a set of international allies, and he does understand the current moment. We're in one of those hatchet moments, like 1848, 1905, 1932, 1968. And if you had to bet which way society would go right now, you'd say once we're in a culture that says we're all in this together. Then we shifted into a culture that says I'm free to be myself, the individualistic culture. And based on current trends, you'd have to say that our coming future is revert to tribe. I was a foreign correspondent in the 1950s. I wasn't born then, believe me. In the 1990s. And I covered a lot of good news. I covered the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, reunification of Germany, Mandela coming out of prison in South Africa, the Oslo peace process, it was nothing but good news, people coming together, the triumph of the liberal democratic order. The last thing I covered was the Yugoslav Civil War. I didn't really pay much attention to it because it seemed so small compared to everything else I covered. In retrospect, that was the most important event I covered, because the last 25 years have been the rise of ethnic nationalism, the rise of tribalism, the rise of strongman politics all around the world. And the society's figuring out, how do we find a new equilibrium where we can actually believe in each other, and reverting to nationalism. And so to me, we're at one of these pivot points in history. When George H.W. Bush crossed the Yale campus in 1941, he heard about Pearl Harbor, and he walked across to the recruiting station and enlisted. He had a sense of faith in America. Today, we don't have anything as dramatic as Pearl Harbor, but when 55,000 people die every year of opioids, that seems to me a silent Pearl Harbor. When classes fight each other and grow further apart, that seems like a silent Pearl Harbor. When 45,000 people kill themselves every year, it seems like a silent Pearl Harbor. And it seems like a moment to do something more than what we normally do, like this institute, to create a sense of cohesion and national purpose. And what's been lost in the atomization of our society is a sense of a national story. I go around to the college where I teach and other colleges, and I ask young people about the national story. I tell them my story. I tell them the story my grandfather told to me, this Exodus story. We won the lottery of life to be born here because this is the greatest nation in history of the earth. And in my generation, about 70% believe that America is the greatest land on earth. Among the current college student generation, 22% believe that. And so there's been this radical decline. And that's in part because I tell them this story of Exodus. We left oppression, crossed the wilderness, came to build the promised land, and they look at me and they say, "You are crazy. That's the story rich white men tell." And there's some truth to what they're saying. And they just don't believe my story. And they don't believe the inherited story. It just doesn't seem real to them. And at some point, you have to respect that that's what they believe. I think the educational system, whoever decided we should stop teaching American history in high schools, did a very effective job. But it's still, you have to accept the fact, okay, so what story can we tell together? What is our new story that we can all believe in? So I've spent a lot of time studying, when do societies turn around? How do you take a society that's spinning out of control in an individualistic way? How do they come back together? And there are two examples of this in history. I used to say, well, it would really help, war is the classic case where countries come back together. And I used to say, well, it would be nice if we got invaded by Canada, but now that might actually happen, so I don't say that anymore. It's happened twice, in my knowledge. I only know a small part of the world. It happened in England between 1810 and 1848, and it happened in this country between 1890 and 1910. In 1890, in this country, we had a big economic transition to industrialization. We had a wave of immigration. We had political corruption. We had a lot of the same problems. And what happened? First, there was a religious revival. The social gospel movement, which was very collective, replaced the social Darwinist movement, which was very individualistic. Second, we had a civic revival. Within 5 years, a whole burst of institutions came into being to bind the communities together. The Boys and Girls Scouts, the Boys and Girls Clubs, the NAACP, the labor unions, the settlement house movement, the environmental movement, the temperance movement. They all bound communities together. And then eventually, after those two things happened, there was a political movement, the progressives. And America really did recover. It came back together. And we had the American century, the 20th century. Today, I don't know if we're seeing a religious revival. I live 10 blocks from the US Capitol. I guarantee you we're not seeing a political revival. But I do think we are seeing a civic revival. There's a sentence at the end of one of Walker Percy's novels. There's only one thing I can do: listen to people, see how they stick themselves into the world, and hand them along. And that sentence, that see how they stick themselves into the world, That was frankly something people in the individualistic era were not good at. Planting themselves down, sticking themselves into the world. So they're committed and planted and settled. My wife and I travel around the country, and what we find everywhere we go is people who have stuck themselves down. We're part of a community in DC called AOK. It's a couple who just live in a home in DC. They had a kid who went to the public schools, and he had a friend named James who didn't have a place to really live and eat. His mom had some health and other issues. And so they said, James can stay with us. And then that kid had a friend, and that kid had a friend. And when I first went to their house about 4 or 5 years ago, there were 15 or 20 mattresses on the floor. When we went to their home at Thursday night, there were 26 kids around the table. I walk in there, I'm a reticent, I might as well have been born in the Midwest. I'm not a real physical, huggy guy kind of guy. I walk in to shake one of the kids' hands. He says, we don't shake hands here, we hug here. And so every Thursday night we gather, we go around the table, we say what we're grateful for, we say what we're worried about. Kids talk about their depression, their health issues, their victories. And it is as tight a community as you can possibly imagine. I brought my daughter there, and she said, that's the warmest place I've ever been. We brought a friend named Bill Milliken, who's been doing youth work for 50 years. He said, people often ask him, what programs turn around lives? He said, I've been doing this all this time. I've never seen a program turn around a life. It's only relationships that turn around lives. And they're re-knitting an extended family at that home. There's a woman we know named Sarah Heminger, who she was from the Midwest. When she was a kid, her dad reported on the church pastor for embezzling money. Instead of getting rid of the pastor, they ostracized her whole family. So she spent 8 years ostracized as a kid, alone. She went to Johns Hopkins. She noticed a lot of kids on the streets of Baltimore who were ostracized and alone. She created an organization called Thread, where they take the lowest performing kids in Baltimore schools, and they have 4 volunteers who are really their parents, then 4 more who are their grandparents, then a circle more to help them. So each kid is suddenly surrounded by a web of relationships, and these people are surrounded with each other. Whenever the kids meet a volunteer, their phones get next to each other, and that contact point gets recorded on her app, which she calls the Fitbit of social relationships. She can tell when there's been a touch, when there's been 3 hours between a touch. She's created a community. So what these 2 organizations are doing is taking the excesses of the age of individualism, the way we're isolated from one another, and they're rebuilding community at the bottom level, at the heart and the soul level. And in my view, before we can have civil conversations with each other, we've got to have some level of trust down at the foundations. I hang around politicians all day, and they do not understand the kind of problem we have. Some decades are defined by a foreign invasion, some by a financial crisis. In other words, they're problems of the market or they're problems of the state. But those 2 institutions rest on a nest, a more fundamental level of substrate. And that substrate is human relationship, social trust, basic decency to one another. And our problems these days are down in the foundation. And people have to deal with the problems down at the foundations, not at the level of law, not at the level of market, and frankly, not at the national level. There's a phrase in the book of Job, and the sparks fly upward. And that's how the solution is going to have to come, at the local level, community by community, as the sparks fly upward. And the problem with relationships is that they don't scale. Relationships are built slowly every day, one by one. But you have enough of these people around the country, what they're doing is they're creating a new culture. Not a culture of individualism that says it's all about me. Not a culture of collectivism where the individual is lost in the collective, but a culture of personalism. A culture that says each individual human being is a person of infinite depth. But when you get down to that deep level of each person, what you find is a longing for relationship, a longing for relationship with each other, and a longing with the relationship with the good. And that is the heart and soul. And so what I find in these people, these community builders all around the country, is a desire to go deep into themselves and to go deeply vulnerable with each other. They have a whole culture which is just trying to come into being. They are morally motivated. They are not primarily interested by money, status, and power. They want connection. They want to feel right with the world. They're deeply relational. They want to get intimate with each other. They've invented technologies of intimacy to get intimate with each other. There is an organization called Becoming a Man in Chicago where they take gang members on the west side, they bring them into a thing called the checkup, and each kid has to check in and say how they're doing spiritually, emotionally, intellectually, and physically. And if the kid is not completely open, the other gang members get all over him. Remember, these are kids who are gang members, they're armored up. But they have to have intimacy. There's radical mutuality. There's a complete rejection of the idea that some of us are haves and some are have-nots. The ethos here is we're all broken, we're all walking this together. There's vocational certitude. I've met thousands of these people now building community all around the country, and the one thing they all say without exception is, I'm going to die doing this. They have no doubts that this is why they were put on this earth, to build this community. And to me, we spend all our time debating Trump, whether you like Trump or not. But to me, that's not where the action is. The action is happening on the local level, all around the culture. A new sort of ethos is being built, a renegotiation of power, a knitting together of institutions, a creating of thick institutions. Some institutions are thick and some are thin. Some you work at a place, you go to college, and you sort of pass through and you don't know. They don't really affect you. You went to the college, you needed a degree, you got out of it, fine, you got your degree. But some institutions are really thick. They transform who you are. If you're a Marine, a Morehouse man, a Juilliard pianist, and these thick institutions have a clear purpose. They know why they're there, what exactly transformation they're trying to do. They have a cramped physical location. They involve face-to-face communication, usually over a dinner table. There's always music involved, because if you've danced with somebody, it's hard to stay distant from them. There's a sacred origin story, a moment when they nearly failed. They often have overnights, so they can see each other after dinner and before they have breakfast, before they put on their makeup. There's a sacred guidebook, an object passed along. My college was a thick institution. It changed me forever. I go to a lot of colleges that are thick institutions. Sewanee University, Kenyon College. I think this is a thick institution. They change whoever you are because they're not afraid to be themselves, to stand out. And when I look at these community builders, I see them not as people only reweaving the fabric of society. I see them creating a cultural revolution. Cultures change when people on the margins of society find a superior way to live, and other people want to follow them. And when I see these people working in these local organizations, they've got a better way to live. And they point to a new American story. It's not the Exodus story. It's not building the promised land. It's a redemption story. It's a story that we are part of a great experiment. It's still a very young experiment. We've screwed it up big time, but it can come back. The great piece of literature of the redemption narrative is Lincoln's second inaugural. When he delivered it, he knew the North was going to win the Civil War. So it could have been a moment of triumph. We were right, you were wrong, we won, you lost. It was the exact opposite. The key words in that story are us, all, and our. They're collective words. He didn't say slavery was a Southern institution. He said it's an American institution, and the wages of this sin correctly fall on all of us. And so it's a great rebinding around a story of a failure and redemption. And so to me, what interests me about these community builders and about that kind of story, it's a fusion story. It's about transcendence. It's about when one person comes together with somebody completely opposite and they fuse. In this age of individualism, we spend a lot of time talking about happiness. We've got happiness research, happiness books. when we use the word happiness, it seems to me we're actually talking about two different things. The first is individual happiness, and that kind of individual happiness flows out of a personal enlargement. You feel happy when you win some victory, you get a promotion, you graduate, you make progress toward your goals, your team wins a football game. And that's the enlargement of self. But there's a different kind of happiness, which is about the erasure of self. It's when you fall into and fuse with another person. And when you think about that kind of happiness, we don't really call it happiness, we call it joy. And joy is different than happiness, and I think we all understand that. I think we all understand that joy is better than happiness because it involves something emotional where you're fusing with another person, and something spiritual. There's something spiritual about joy. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about joy and collecting examples and descriptions of joy. And they're like different levels of it. There's like spiritual joy or physical joy. I was talking to some of the students today, and I mentioned to them this quote from the novelist Zadie Smith. And she has a good description of what physical joy, what collective effervescence feels like. She's in London in 1999, and she's at a nightclub. She's lost her friends. She's looking for her handbag, when suddenly the hip-hop artist Q-Tip can be heard rapping over the sound system. And she writes, "A real thin man with enormous eyes reached across a sea of bodies for my hand. He kept asking me the same thing over and over. You feelin' it?" I was. My ridiculous heels were killing me. I was terrified I might die, yet I felt simultaneously overwhelmed with delight that Can I Kick It should happen to be playing in this moment of history on this sound system, and was now morphing into Smells Like Teen Spirit. I took the man's hand, the top of my head flew away. We danced and danced, we gave ourselves over to joy. That's losing yourself in the moment. The second is what you might call emotional joy, the kind of joy you feel when your heart is really bonded with another person. One of my favorite descriptions of that is from a heroine of mine named Dorothy Day. She was about to give birth when she realized that all the accounts of birth she'd ever read were written by guys. So 40 minutes after literally giving birth, she sat down and wrote a beautiful essay of what it felt like. And a lot of it is violent, or the pain of it. This was back in the 1920s or so. But then her essay finishes with this passage. If I had written the greatest book, composed the greatest symphony, or carved the most exquisite figure, I could not have felt the more exalted creator than I did when they placed my child in my arms. No human creature could receive or contain so vast a flood of love and joy as I felt after the birth of my child. With this came a need to worship and to adore. A transcendent moment of fusion with her new daughter. Another layer is what you might call spiritual joy, connection with the natural world, the transcendent order. I have a friend who's a poet named Chris Wyman, and Chris is the kind of guy who, in his early adulthood, he lived in a lot of places, a lot of odd places. And you ask him, why do you live in Buffalo? He'd say, well, there's a girl there. And then you say, well, why'd you live in Prague? Oh, there was a girl there. And so he just chased girls around through his 20s. Not a bad way to spend your 20s. But he was in Prague one day, and he was working on his poetry on the kitchen table. And suddenly a falcon landed on the windowsill. And he was transfixed by this falcon. It was just like 3 feet from him. He didn't notice him yet. He was just scanning the street. And Wyman called into his girlfriend, come here, and she was in the shower. So she runs out dripping wet and naked. And they stare, looking at this bird. And then the bird turns his head and locks eyes with Wyman. And they're all just frozen. And his girlfriend says, wish for something. Like, take advantage of this moment. And Wyman later wrote a poem about it, which includes this stanza. And for a long moment I'm still in. I wished and I wished and I wished that the moment would not end. And just like that, it vanished. And sometimes the difference about joy is happiness we create, but joy we're seized by. It's something that sweeps over us. And to me, the highest form of joy is not even spiritual joy, it's moral joy. And this is a joy of people, and I bet you met them, I meet them like once, pretty frequently these days, who, for them, joy is not an experience, it's an outlook. It's the way they see the world. They radiate goodness, they care about you, they don't care about themselves. They've moved, I think of this from Ptolemy to Copernicus. For Ptolemy, the universe is all revolving around us. Copernicus, we're revolving around others. And they really live a life where they've given themselves over to selfless service. And when they do that and they forget the needs and desires of the ego, they really become joyous. I was with the Dalai Lama a few months ago, or years ago now, and I was sitting next to him and he just radiated joy. He laughs for no apparent reason. Like he just bursts out laughing for no reason. And I wanted to be polite, so I started laughing, and then he laughed, and I laughed. He just radiates joy. He's a celebrity. I was up in Frederick, Maryland with some ladies who teach immigrants English and how to read. They just were patient and good and gentle, and they just radiated that joy. And it's because they're really not thinking about themselves at all. They're not asking, am I happy? They're just giving. And that is how community gets thickened. And to me, the country is now in a valley, in one of these hatchet moments where we're lost in our own self-conceptions and our hostilities and our resentments. But I have total faith in human nature to be ingenious and for people to come together. And these people, I think, are leading a cultural revolution if we would only pay attention to them and learn from them, that will lead to renegotiation of power and a re-coming together of people and a redemption of nation. One of the things I'll end on is that the country can seem so divided, but there have been other times in division where people became aware of the things that actually unite us and how these things stretch back in history for hundreds and hundreds of years. I'm going to read a letter, a part of a letter that I'm sure many of you know, but I like reading it. It was written on July 14th, 1861, on the day of the first Battle of Bull Run, which is one of the early in the Civil War, just outside of D.C. Some of you probably know this letter. It was written by a guy named Sullivan Ballou, who was an officer from Rhode Island. And he had lost his parents when he was young, and he knew what it was like to grow up in an orphanage. So he writes to his wife, Sarah, and he said, I really do not want to die in battle. And he wrote to her, my love for you is deathless. It seems to bind me to you with mighty cables that nothing but omnipotence can break. Yet my love of country comes over me like a strong wind and bears me irresistibly on with all these chains to the battlefield. He felt a great indebtedness to the past. I know how strongly American civilization now leans upon the triumph of the government and how great a debt we owe to those who went before us through the blood and suffering of the revolution. And I am willing, perfectly willing, to lay down all my joys in this life to help maintain this government and to pay that debt. Now, of course, he then did die the next day in the battle. But he illustrates to us the things that we forget in moments of normalcy, that cord that brought all our ancestors here is still a binding cord that can be re-inflamed if the connections of community and heart and soul are bound together. Thank you very much.